Nobody expected Scott Finley to become Newport's reluctant hero that fateful afternoon at Oakwood Terrace. Living paycheck to paycheck in Milltown with mounting bills for his mother's care, Scott was just another construction worker, until he risked everything to pull Diane Calloway from beneath tons of collapsed concrete as the building crumbled around them. The next morning, bewildered neighbors watched as a helicopter landed outside his modest flat, carrying Louis Armstrong, CEO of a prestigious construction firm, and the very man whose testimony had destroyed Scott's engineering career years earlier. This is the extraordinary story of a gifted structural engineer forced into obscurity by corporate greed, whose heroic rescue revealed the exceptional talent that had been hiding in plain sight, sparking a dangerous journey of redemption that would expose corruption at the highest levels and change Newport's skyline forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The copper-colored sun broke through thick clouds, casting long shadows across the Oakwood Terrace construction site. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh concrete, mixed with the metallic tang of steel. Scott Finley, 45, with a spine curved from years of labor, crouched beside an exposed support column, his weathered hands moving methodically as he examined the materials. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. His faded blue work shirt hung loosely on his lean frame, the name patch reading Scott, almost illegible from countless washes. Trevor Wilson, the site foreman, approached with a clipboard, his heavy boots kicking up dust with each step. "Finley, we're behind schedule. Whatever you're doing, wrap it up." Scott ran his fingers along a hairline crack in the concrete, his brow furrowing. "Trevor, look at this. The mix ratio is off. This isn't curing properly." Trevor barely glanced at the column. "If you spent as much time working as you do inspecting, we might actually finish on time. This isn't about the schedule, it's about safety." Scott stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "These support columns won't hold under stress. They need to be redone." "Not your call, Finley. The inspector signed off on it yesterday." Scott's jaw tightened. "Hayes was here. He couldn't have examined this properly." "Listen." Trevor lowered his voice, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Mr. Kingsley is pushing for completion by month's end. We've got potential tenants touring next week. Your job is to follow the plans, not question them." The mention of Roland Kingsley, the developer behind Oakwood Terrace, sent a familiar chill down Scott's spine. He'd seen this before: corners cut, warnings ignored, deadlines prioritized over safety. 5 years ago, it had cost 4 lives and his career. "These columns won't support the upper floors, not with this concrete mix. You know that." Trevor's expression hardened. "What I know is that you need this job, and I know why." He paused, the unspoken reference to Scott's mother hanging between them. "Just do your work, Finley. Leave the engineering to the engineers." The irony wasn't lost on Scott. He had been an engineer, one of the best in Newport, until the Somerset Plaza collapse. Now he was just another laborer, his expertise dismissed, his warnings unheeded. As Trevor walked away, Scott stared at the column, the familiar sense of dread building in his gut. History was repeating itself, and he seemed powerless to stop. The workday dragged on, with Scott keeping to himself, methodically completing his tasks, while mentally cataloguing every deviation from proper building standards. By late afternoon, his notepad was filled with observations: inadequate rebar spacing, substandard materials, rushed concrete pours. Each alone might pass inspection. Together, they spelled disaster. As his shift ended, Scott noticed a woman walking through the partially completed lobby of the building. Wearing business casual attire and carrying a notebook, she seemed out of place among the construction equipment. Curiosity piqued. He watched as she examined the exposed beams, occasionally taking notes. "Can I help you?" Scott approached, wiping dust from his hands. "This is an active construction site, not really safe for visitors." The woman turned, revealing striking green eyes and a composed expression. "I'm Diane Calloway. I've reserved one of the penthouse units. Mr. Kingsley gave me permission to stop by occasionally to check on progress." Scott nodded, though something about her explanation felt off. Most future tenants didn't examine structural elements with such careful attention. "Well, Miss Calloway, since you're going to be living here, you might want to know that this building has some issues." Diane's eyebrow raised slightly. "What kind of issues?" Scott hesitated. Speaking out had cost him everything once before, yet the alternative, remaining silent, was unthinkable. "Structural ones, the kind that don't show up in glossy brochures. You sound like you know what you're talking about." Diane studied him with newfound interest. "I used to be a structural engineer." The admission felt like opening an old wound. "Now, I just follow orders." "What happened?" Scott's phone buzzed in his pocket, saving him from answering. The screen displayed the Sunset Haven Care Facilities number. His heart sank. "I need to take this. Excuse me." Stepping away, he answered, "This is Scott Finley." The voice on the other end was apologetic but firm. "Mr. Finley, it's Janice from Sunset Haven. I'm calling about your mother's account. We're now 3 weeks past due." Scott closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I know I get paid Friday. I'll bring the payment then." "Mr. Finley, we've been very accommodating, but we can't continue to... Please, just until Friday. She needs the specialized care you provide. I'm working extra shifts." A heavy sigh came through the phone. "All right, Friday, but we really can't extend beyond that." "Thank you. I'll be there." Scott ended the call, the weight on his shoulders growing heavier. When he turned around, Diane was still there, pretending not to have overheard. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Fine." Scott's tone made it clear the subject was closed. "You should probably head out. We're shutting down for the day." Diane nodded, but instead of leaving, she handed him a business card. "If you want to talk more about those structural issues, call me. I'm very interested." Scott pocketed the card without looking at it, watching as she walked away. Something about Diane Calloway didn't add up. Penthouse tenants didn't typically concern themselves with construction details, and they certainly didn't seek out conversations with laborers. The ride to Sunset Haven took 40 minutes on his rattling motorcycle, each mile increasing his determination to somehow make things right. The care facility sat on the outskirts of Newport, a one-story building painted in calming pastels, surrounded by well-maintained gardens. Despite its cheerful appearance, Scott always felt a pang of guilt walking through its doors, as if he had failed his mother by placing her here. Vera Finley's room was at the end of a long corridor, decorated with family photos and the few mementos they'd managed to keep after selling their house. At 72, Vera's once vibrant presence had been diminished by early-onset dementia, but her eyes still lit up when Scott entered. "There's my boy," she smiled, reaching out a thin hand. Scott took it gently, sitting on the edge of her bed. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" "Oh, just fine. The nurse, the nice one with the curly hair, she brought me extra pudding." Vera's gaze drifted to the window. "Is your father coming later?" "He promised to take me dancing." The familiar ache spread through Scott's chest. His father had been dead for 15 years. "Not today, Mom. He's working late." Vera nodded, accepting. This without question. "You look tired, Scott. Are they working you too hard at that fancy engineering firm?" For a moment, Scott considered correcting her, explaining once again that he no longer designed buildings, but instead labored to construct them. But the peaceful look on her face stopped him. In her mind, he was still the successful engineer, the pride of their family. "It's challenging work," he said instead, "but important. You always did care about doing things right, even as a little boy." Vera patted his hand. "Your father used to say you'd build something that would change the world someday." Scott swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm still trying, Mom." They spent the next hour in comfortable conversation, Vera drifting between present and past, Scott gently guiding her back when she became confused. As visiting hours came to an end, he promised to return soon. Outside Vera's room, Molly Davis, the social worker assigned to his mother's case, was waiting. Her expression was sympathetic but resolute. "Scott, we need to talk about the payment situation." "I know, I'll have it Friday, all of it." Molly sighed. "It's not just this month I'm worried about. The costs are increasing and your mother needs more specialized care. Have you considered applying for additional assistance programs?" "I've applied for everything available." Scott's voice was tired. "Most have waiting lists or we don't qualify. I'm handling it by working yourself to exhaustion." Molly shook her head. "You can't keep this up. You need to think about sustainable solutions." The irony of discussing sustainable solutions while building an unsustainable structure wasn't lost on Scott. "I'm open to suggestions. There's a new program through the city for families of dementia patients. Let me get you the paperwork." As Molly walked to her office, Scott leaned against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. He was trapped in an impossible situation, needing the job at Oakwood Terrace to pay for his mother's care, yet knowing that the building was dangerous. Speaking out would cost him his livelihood. Staying silent might cost lives. The ride back to his apartment in Milltown was dark and cold, the motorcycle's headlight cutting through the night. His flat was on the 3rd floor of a converted factory building, its brick exterior crumbling in places, windows drafty. It wasn't much, but it was what he could afford while paying for Sunset Haven. Inside, Scott collapsed onto his worn couch, finally pulling out Diane Calloway's business card. His eyes widened as he read it. Diane Calloway, investigative journalist, Newport Chronicle. Not a tenant at all, but a reporter. The realization was both alarming and intriguing. What was she investigating, and why pretend to be a future resident? Too exhausted to ponder further, Scott set his alarm for another early shift and fell into a restless sleep. Dreams filled with crumbling concrete and the faces of those who had died at Somerset Plaza. Morning came too soon, grey light filtering through thin curtains. Scott's body protested as he rose, muscles aching from years of physical labor they were never trained for. As he prepared for work, the weather report warned of heavy rain, complicating the day ahead. By the time he arrived at Oakwood Terrace, dark clouds loomed overhead, promising a downpour. The site was buzzing with activity, workers rushing to secure materials before the rain began. Trevor intercepted him near the entrance. "Change of plans today. Kingsley's bringing potential investors for a tour at noon. I need you on the 8th floor, finishing the model unit." The 8th floor? Trevor, that level isn't structurally sound yet. The concrete on those support columns hasn't properly cured. Trevor's expression darkened. "This isn't up for debate. Hayes signed off on it, so it's safe, got it?" "Hayes is either incompetent or corrupt," Scott muttered, loud enough for Trevor to hear. The foreman grabbed Scott's arm, pulling him aside. "Listen carefully. One more comment like that, and you're done. No warnings, no second chances. Done. Understand?" Scott jerked his arm free, the familiar anger rising. "Perfectly. I understand that you're willing to risk people's lives to meet a deadline." "You self-righteous..." Trevor stopped himself, taking a deep breath. 8th floor. Model unit. Now, as Scott made his way up, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the temporary tarps covering unfinished sections of the building. By the time he reached the 8th floor, it had become a steady downpour, water finding its way Through gaps in the construction, the model unit was mostly complete, with pristine white walls, gleaming fixtures, and expansive windows overlooking Newport. It was designed to sell a dream, luxury, living with panoramic views. But as Scott worked, he couldn't ignore the subtle signs of trouble, a slight unevenness in the floor, hairline cracks appearing in the corners where excessive weight strained the insufficiently supported structure. Around noon, voices echoed. From the corridor, Scott recognized Roland Kingsley's authoritative tone immediately, followed by the murmurs of impressed investors. He continued working, head down, as the group entered the model unit. "As you can see," Kingsley was saying, "these penthouse units offer unparalleled views and premium finishes. We're ahead of schedule, with move-ins projected to begin next month." Scott tensed, but remained focused on his task, hoping to avoid attention. His hope was short-lived. "This is one of our skilled workers," Kingsley said, noticing Scott. "Part of the dedicated team bringing Oakwood Terrace to life." Forced to acknowledge them, Scott turned, coming face to face with Roland Kingsley for the first time. The developer was in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His silver hair perfectly styled, exuding confidence and success. Beside him stood Milton Hayes, the building inspector, whose signature had approved substandard work, along with 3 well-dressed investors, and Diane Calloway, notebook in hand, watching Scott with undisguised interest. Scott Finley, Kingsley read from his name patch, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Any relation to the Finley involved in the Somerset Plaza incident? The room seemed to still, all eyes turning to Scott. "That would be me," he admitted, his voice level despite the churning in his stomach. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Diane's pen hovered over her notebook. Kingsley's smile never wavered, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Interesting. Well, we believe in second chances here at Kingsley Properties." He turned to his investors. "Shall we continue to the rooftop terrace? The rain has almost stopped and the view is spectacular." As the group filed out, Diane lingered, catching Scott's eye. "Mr. Finley, quite a coincidence finding you here. Is it?" Scott's voice was quiet. "Or was finding me the point of your visit yesterday?" Before she could answer, a low, ominous groan echoed through the building, followed by the sound of shifting concrete. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out. In the sudden silence that followed, Scott's experienced ear recognized the sound that had haunted his nightmares for 5 years, the sound of a structure beginning to fail. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Everyone out, now!" Scott's command cut through the shocked silence. "The building's compromised." Kingsley's confident demeanor faltered. "It's just a power surge. No need for—" Another groan interrupted him, louder this time, followed by a visible shift in the floor beneath their feet. Fine dust rained down from the ceiling as hairline cracks spiderwebbed across the pristine walls of the model unit. "Move!" Scott grabbed Diane's arm, pulling her toward the stairwell. The investors followed, panic replacing their earlier admiration. Hayes lingered, exchanging a worried glance with Kingsley before both men hurried after the group. The emergency lights cast an eerie glow in the stairwell as they descended. Scott led the way, hyper-aware of every creak and groan emanating from the structure around them. They had just reached the 6th-floor landing when a tremendous crack echoed above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of concrete giving way. "Faster!" Scott urged, practically pushing the group down the stairs. The building was coming apart much more quickly than he had anticipated. The compromised concrete, saturated by rain seeping through inadequate waterproofing, was failing under the weight of the upper floors. They made it to the 4th floor when a section of stairs above them collapsed, sending chunks of concrete bouncing down the stairwell. One of the investors stumbled, crying out in pain as debris struck his shoulder. "Help him!" Scott instructed Diane, who immediately took the injured man's arm. Scott turned to Kingsley, whose face had gone ashen. "Is anyone else in the building? Other workers?" For the first time, uncertainty cracked Kingsley's imperious facade. I don't know. Trevor would know." "Hayes," Scott turned to the inspector, "you have the safety evacuation plan. Who's where?" Hayes fumbled with his phone. "Third floor electrical team, fifth floor plumbing, seventh floor, broadcast and evacuation now," Scott ordered. "Emergency. Channels." Hayes tapped frantically at his phone. The authority he had wielded earlier evaporated in the face of actual crisis. The group continued downward, the building shuddering around them. When they reached the second floor, they encountered a stream of workers fleeing toward the main exit, faces tight with fear. "Scott!" Trevor appeared, clipboard still in hand despite the chaos. "East Wing is collapsing. We've got most people out, but there are still workers trapped on 3. Without hesitation, Scott changed direction, heading back up the stairs they had just descended. "Where are you going?" Diane called after him. "To get those workers. Are you insane? This place is coming down." Scott paused, meeting her gaze. "I know exactly how it's coming down. I've seen it before." The unspoken reference to Somerset Plaza hung between them. "Get everyone else out. I'll be right behind you." Before she could protest further, he was gone, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The third floor was filled with swirling dust, making it difficult to breathe. Support beams had buckled, causing sections of the ceiling to collapse onto workstations. "Below! Hello?" Scott called, straining to hear any response over the groaning structure. "Anyone here?" A weak voice answered from beneath a partially collapsed wall section. "Here, we're trapped." Scott made his way carefully across the unstable floor, finding 2 electrical workers pinned by debris. One was unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The other, a young man barely in his 20s, looked at Scott with naked relief. "The whole thing just came down," he explained shakily. "No warning." "I'm going to get you out," Scott promised, assessing the fallen. Materials. The unconscious worker was pinned by a support beam that Scott couldn't move alone. "What's your name?" "Eddie." "That's Mark. Is he?" "He's alive." Scott quickly checked the injured man's pulse. "Can you move at all?" Eddie tried shifting. "My leg's trapped, but I think it's just debris, not the beam." Scott began carefully removing chunks of drywall and insulation, freeing Eddie's leg. As he worked, the building continued to groan and shift, each sound amplifying his urgency. "We need to get help for Mark," Scott said as he finally extracted Eddie. "Can you walk?" Eddie tested his weight on his injured leg, wincing but nodding. "I think so." "Take the west stairwell, it's still intact. Tell them we need a trauma team and extraction equipment for Mark." "What about you?" "I'll stay with him. Now go." As Eddie limped toward the stairwell, Scott turned his attention to Mark. Moving the beam alone was impossible, but perhaps he could stabilize the area to prevent further collapse until help arrived. He was gathering materials to brace the beam when a familiar voice called out, "Scott! Are you up here?" Diane emerged from the dust, a handkerchief pressed over her mouth and nose. "What are you doing?" Scott demanded. "I told you to get out." "I'm not leaving you to be a martyr." She assessed the situation quickly. "What do you need?" Despite himself, Scott was impressed by her composure. "Help me with this beam. If we can lift it just enough, I might be able to pull him free." Together they positioned themselves on either side of the heavy beam. "On 3, Scott directed. 1, 2, 3. They strained, muscles trembling with effort, managing to raise the beam a few crucial inches. Scott quickly reached under, grabbing Mark's shoulders and pulling him clear before they let the beam crash back down. "Is he breathing?" Diane asked, kneeling beside the unconscious worker. Scott checked. "Yes, but we need to get him out now." A massive shudder ran through the building, and the floor beneath them dropped several inches, tilting alarmingly toward the collapsed east wing. Too late. Scott muttered, looking around frantically for an alternative exit. The main stairwell was now inaccessible, cut off by the widening chasm in the floor. "The service elevator shaft, this way!" Supporting Mark between them, they made their way toward the back of the floor, where a utility elevator had been installed for moving construction materials. The elevator itself wasn't operational, but the shaft might provide a way down. They had almost reached it when the floor gave another violent lurch. Diane lost her footing, sliding toward a gaping hole where concrete had given way. Scott lunged, catching her wrist while maintaining his grip on Mark with his other arm. For a moment, they hung suspended in a precarious balance. Scott anchored against a doorframe, Diane dangling over the void, Mark's unconscious weight threatening to pull them all down. With a guttural cry of effort, Scott pulled Diane back from the edge, the three of them collapsing in a heap on the relatively stable portion of floor near the elevator shaft. "That's twice I've saved your life today," Scott gasped, his heart pounding. "Maybe stop following me into collapsing buildings." Despite the dire situation, Diane managed a shaky smile. "Where's the story in that?" "The story is going to be 3 bodies found in the rubble if we don't move." Scott forced open the elevator doors, revealing the empty shaft. A service ladder ran along one wall, disappearing into darkness below. "We can't carry him down that," Diane observed, looking at Mark's limp form. "No," Scott agreed, quickly removing his belt. "But we can secure him and lower him down." He began fashioning a makeshift harness from his belt and electrical cords, scavenged from nearby. "I'll go down first, then you'll help lower him to me. After that, you follow." The plan was desperate, but with the building disintegrating around them, options were scarce. Scott climbed onto the ladder, descending into the shaft until he was about 15 feet below the opening. "Okay, start lowering him." Diane struggled with Mark's weight, but managed to secure the improvised harness and begin slowly feeding the cord down to Scott. The unconscious man dangled precariously, spinning slightly as he descended. When Mark was within reach, Scott secured him against his own body with one arm, maintaining a white-knuckled grip on the ladder with the other. "Got him, your turn." Diane had just swung her legs into the shaft when a final catastrophic failure sent the remaining section of the 3rd floor collapsing inward. Scott watched in horror as Diane disappeared from view, the opening now filled with tumbling debris. "Diane!" No answer came. Dust and small pieces of concrete rained down the shaft, forcing Scott to press himself and Mark against the ladder to avoid being struck. When the initial collapse subsided, Scott called out again. "Diane, can you hear me?" A faint cough then. "I'm here, trapped. Can't reach the ladder." Scott's mind raced. He couldn't climb back up with Mark, but leaving him alone at the bottom of the shaft wasn't an option either, and every second counted. With Diane trapped in an actively collapsing building. "I'm going to get Mark to safety, then I'm coming back for you," he shouted. "Stay as still as possible. Don't try to move the debris yourself." "Hurry," came the faint reply. The descent with Mark was agonizingly slow, Scott's muscles screaming in protest as he essentially carried the man down one-handed. When they finally reached the bottom of the shaft, Scott was relieved to find the ground floor relatively intact, though filled with dust and evacuated workers watching from a safe distance outside. Emergency responders had arrived, their lights flashing through the haze. 2 paramedics rushed forward as Scott emerged from the elevator shaft with Mark. "He needs immediate medical attention," Scott instructed, transferring the injured worker to their care. "And there's a woman trapped on the 3rd floor, east side. Elevator shaft. She needs extraction now." A firefighter approached, taking in Scott's dust-covered appearance. "Sir, you need to evacuate. The structure is highly unstable." "There's someone still trapped up there," Scott insisted, already turning back toward the shaft. "We have rescue personnel for that. You need to—" "I know exactly where she is and how to reach her. Every second counts." The firefighter hesitated. then gave a reluctant nod. Thompson, Sullivan, gear up and go with him. Full extraction equipment. Equipped with proper rescue gear and accompanied by 2 firefighters, Scott re-entered the building. The ascent through the shaft was more difficult than the descent had been, with debris now partially blocking the ladder at various points. When they reached the 3rd floor, they found a scene of devastation. The opening where Diane had been was now a confusion of broken concrete, twisted metal, and shattered drywall. "Diane!" Scott called, fearing the worst. A weak voice responded from beneath a section of collapsed ceiling. "Here!" Working frantically but methodically, Scott and the firefighters began removing debris, creating a path to the trapped journalist. They found her pinned beneath a fallen support beam, conscious but clearly in pain. "My leg," she gasped as they reached her. "I can't feel my leg." The firefighters exchanged a concerned glance, but Scott maintained a reassuring expression. "We're going to get you out. Just stay with me." Using hydraulic equipment, they managed to lift the beam enough to extract Diane. Her right leg was badly injured, blood seeping through her torn pants. "We need to move now," one of the firefighters urged, as another ominous rumble shook the remaining structure. This whole floor could go any minute. The journey back down the elevator shaft was a controlled emergency, with Diane secured in a rescue harness and lowered carefully by the firefighters. Scott descended alongside her, maintaining constant eye contact, keeping her focused and conscious despite the pain and fear. "Why did you come back into the building?" he asked, partly to keep her alert, partly out of genuine curiosity. Diane's face was pale with pain, but her green eyes remained clear. "Same reason you did. Couldn't leave someone behind." When they finally emerged at the bottom, a team of paramedics was waiting. As they transferred Diane to a stretcher, she grabbed Scott's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You risked everything for a stranger." "Just doing what's right," Scott replied, suddenly uncomfortable with her gratitude as the paramedics wheeled her toward the ambulance. Diane called back, "This isn't over, Scott Finley. We need to talk." Scott watched her go, then turned to survey the devastation of Oakwood Terrace. The east wing had completely collapsed, while the west side was severely compromised. Portions of upper floors visible through massive holes in the exterior. Emergency vehicles surrounded the site, their lights painting the scene in surreal flashes of red and blue. Trevor approached, his earlier antagonism replaced by shock. "You saved them. Eddie, Mark, that reporter woman. They'd all be dead if not for you." Scott didn't respond, his attention caught by Roland Kingsley standing near a police cruiser, gesticulating angrily as an officer took notes. Milton Hayes stood nearby, his face ashen, looking like he might vomit at any moment. "They're saying it was water damage from the rain," Trevor continued, following Scott's gaze. "Unforeseen circumstances. Act of God." Scott's exhaustion gave way to a flash of anger. "It wasn't the rain, Trevor. It was cut corners, substandard materials, rushed construction. It was prioritizing profit over safety, and it was entirely foreseeable." Before Trevor could respond, a police detective approached. "Mr. Finley, I need to ask you some questions about the structural integrity of this building." The questioning lasted over an hour, Scott providing detailed explanations of the deficiencies he had observed, the warnings he had given, and the specific failures that had led to the collapse. The detective took copious notes, occasionally glancing toward Kingsley, who was now seated in the back of a police car, though not handcuffed. "You seem to know a lot about structural engineering for a construction worker," the detective observed. "I was a structural engineer for 15 years before Somerset Plaza." Recognition dawned in the detective's eyes. "That was you, the engineer who claimed the developer altered his designs?" "The engineer who was right," Scott corrected tiredly, "but couldn't prove it before 4 people died." The detective studied him thoughtfully, And now this. Quite a coincidence. Not really. The same corners get cut, the same warnings get ignored, the same people profit until something collapses. When the detective finally released him, night had fallen. Emergency lights illuminated the continuing rescue efforts, though by now it was primarily a recovery operation, searching for bodies rather than survivors. Miraculously, the early evacuation had prevented mass casualties, with only 3 confirmed deaths, all workers who had been in the East Wing when the initial collapse occurred. Scott made his way through the crowd of onlookers, first responders and displaced workers, his body aching with exhaustion. His motorcycle was still in the parking area, somehow undamaged by falling debris. As he approached it, a suited man stepped out from beside a black sedan. "Mr. Finley, a moment of your time." Scott paused, too tired to be suspicious. "Who are you?" James Reynolds, legal counsel for Armstrong Construction. The lawyer handed Scott a business card. "My employer would like to meet with you tomorrow morning. It's a matter of some urgency." Scott stared at the card, the name Armstrong triggering a complex mix of emotions. Louis Armstrong had been his mentor, then his colleague, and finally, the key witness against him in the Somerset Plaza investigation. "What does Louis want with me?" "That's for him to explain. A car will pick you up at 8 tomorrow morning." The lawyer handed Scott an envelope. "This is a good faith payment for your time." Inside the envelope was a cashier's check for $5,000, almost exactly the amount Scott owed to Sunset Haven. "I haven't agreed to anything yet," Scott said, suspicious of the perfectly timed financial lifeline. "The payment is yours regardless. Mr. Armstrong is simply requesting a conversation." The lawyer handed him a second envelope. "This contains information you may find relevant to that conversation." "Good evening, Mr. Finley." Scott watched as the lawyer returned to the sedan and drove away. Too exhausted to examine the second envelope, he tucked both into his jacket and mounted his motorcycle. The ride to Milltown was a blur, his mind replaying images of the collapse, of Diane's trapped form, of the bodies being recovered as he left. His apartment building was dark and quiet when he arrived, most residents already asleep. Scott trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, his legs leaden with fatigue. Inside his flat, he dropped the envelopes on the kitchen counter and headed straight for the shower, desperate to wash away the concrete dust that seemed embedded in his very pores. As hot water cascaded over his battered body, Scott finally allowed himself to process the day's events. He had warned them. He had known the building was unsafe, and still 3 people were dead. Different faces than Somerset Plaza, but the same story, lives sacrificed to corporate greed and regulatory failure. Clean but still haunted, Scott emerged from the bathroom to find his phone blinking with messages. 2 from Sunset Haven asking about the payment, 1 from Molly Davis checking if he was okay after seeing news of the collapse, and a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Important information about Kingsley. Meet me, Diane Calloway." Scott set the phone aside, turning instead to the envelopes from Armstrong's lawyer. The check was legitimate, drawn on Armstrong Construction's account. The second envelope contained newspaper clippings about the Somerset Plaza collapse, court transcripts from the subsequent investigation, and a USB drive. Too tired to make sense of it all, Scott collapsed onto his bed, the day's adrenaline finally giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. His last conscious thought was of Diane Calloway asking why he'd risked his life to save strangers. The answer was simpler than she knew, because he'd failed to save them once before, and he couldn't bear to fail again. Scott awoke to insistent knocking. Disoriented, he glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. He had slept through his alarm. The knocking continued as he pulled on a t-shirt and sweatpants, making his way groggily to the door. When he opened it, the sight that greeted him was so unexpected that for a moment Scott wondered if he was still dreaming. 3 men in suits stood in the hallway. Behind them, visible through his apartment building's grimy window, was a sleek black helicopter, its rotors slowly turning as it sat in the small park across the street. "Mr. Finley," the lead man said, extending his hand. "I'm Carl Weber, head of security for Armstrong Construction. Mr. Armstrong sends his apologies for the early arrival, but there's been a development. He needs to see you immediately." Scott stared past them at the helicopter, emblazoned with the Armstrong Construction logo. Neighbors were gathering at windows and on the street, pointing and taking photos of the unprecedented sight in Milltown. "What kind of development?" Scott asked, suddenly very awake. "Roland Kingsley was found dead in his home an hour ago, apparent suicide." The news hit Scott like a physical blow. "Suicide?" Weber's expression was grave. "The police are calling it that. Mr. Armstrong believes otherwise, and he thinks you may be in danger as well." As if responding to that cue, Scott's phone rang. The screen displayed Sunset Haven's number. "I need to take this," he said, stepping back into his apartment. "Mr. Finley," came Janice's worried voice, "there are men here asking questions about you and your mother. They don't look like police, and they're making us very uncomfortable. Should we call security?" A chill ran down Scott's spine. "Don't confront them. I'll be there soon. Is my mother safe?" "She's in the secure wing. They can't access that area without authorization." "Good. Lock down the facility if you need to." "I'm on my way." Scott ended the call, turning to Weber with newfound urgency. "How fast can that helicopter get to Sunset Haven?" 10 minutes later, Scott was in the helicopter, soaring over Newport. The city sprawled beneath them, morning sunlight, glinting off glass towers, and the winding river that bisected the urban landscape. In different circumstances, Scott might have appreciated the view. Now, his thoughts were fixed firmly on his mother's safety. "What exactly did Armstrong tell you about Kingsley's death?" Scott asked Weber, who sat across from him in the luxurious cabin. "Only that the circumstances were suspicious. Kingsley had no history of depression or suicidal thoughts, and the timing immediately after the Oakwood collapse." Weber let the implication hang in the air. Scott gazed out the window, processing this information. "Who else knows about the connection between Armstrong and me?" "I'm not privy to that information," Weber replied, his professional demeanor unwavering. "Mr. Armstrong will explain everything when you meet." The helicopter banked sharply, heading toward the outskirts of Newport, where Sunset Haven was located. From the air, Scott could see 2 dark SUVs parked in the facility's lot, confirming Janice's call about suspicious visitors. "Those vehicles," Scott pointed, "can you identify them?" Weber studied them through narrow eyes. "Private security, most likely, not government." "Set down in the backfield," Scott instructed. "I don't want to announce our arrival." The pilot complied, bringing the helicopter down in an empty field behind the care facility. Scott was out before the skids fully settled on the ground, with Weber and 1 security team member following close behind. They entered through a service door, Scott's familiarity with the building guiding them through back corridors toward the administrative offices. They found Janice behind the reception desk, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Finley, thank goodness. Those men left just minutes ago, but they were asking all sorts of questions. When you visit, your mother's condition, her daily schedule." "Where's my mother now?" "In the garden with Molly. We thought it best to maintain normal routines while increasing security." Scott nodded. "You did the right thing. Can you show us the security footage of these men?" In the small security office, they reviewed the camera feeds. 2 men in dark suits had entered the facility at 6:45 a.m. presenting what appeared to be private investigator credentials. Their faces were partially visible to the cameras, one middle-aged with a scar across his right cheek, the other younger with close-cropped blonde hair. "Do you recognize them?" Weber asked, studying the footage. Scott shook his head. "Never seen them before." He turned to Janice. "I need to move my mother to a more secure location immediately." But her care plan, her medications, will arrange for everything she needs, Weber interjected, already on his phone. Armstrong Construction has relationships with private medical facilities across the state. Scott's expression hardened. I haven't agreed to anything with Armstrong yet. Your mother's safety comes first, Weber replied evenly. Mr. Armstrong authorized whatever resources necessary, no strings attached. Scott wanted to refuse on principle, accepting help from the man who had testified against him felt like a betrayal of everything he'd stood for. But Vera's safety outweighed his pride. Fine, make the arrangements. I need to see my mother. The garden was Vera's favorite place at Sunset Haven, a meticulously maintained space with flowering plants and comfortable seating areas. Scott found her sitting beside a rose bush, Molly Davis at her side. Despite the morning's chaos, Vera looked peaceful, unaware of the danger potentially circling around her. Scott! Vera's face lit up at the sight of her son. You're early today, and you've brought friends from work. Scott glanced back at Weber, who maintained a respectful distance. Something like that, Mom. Listen, we need to take a little trip today. Vera's brow furrowed. A trip? But today is bingo day. Margaret and I are partners. I know, but this is important. Scott knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Remember how you always wanted to stay at that fancy lakeside cabin? The one in the magazine? A distant memory sparked in Vera's eyes. Years ago, before her illness, she had kept a magazine clipping of a luxury care facility set on a private lake, saying it looked like heaven on earth. It had been far beyond. Their means then. Likely still was, unless Armstrong was being extraordinarily generous. The one with the ducks? Vera asked, a childlike excitement entering her voice. That's the one. We're going to stay there for a while, just until things settle down here. Molly gave Scott a questioning look over Vera's head, obviously concerned by this sudden change, but professional enough not to question it in front of his mother. I'll help your mother pack, she offered. Perhaps you could brief me on this new arrangement. As Molly led Vera inside, Scott explained the situation as succinctly as possible. Molly's expression grew increasingly alarmed. These men were asking about her daily routines. That's disturbing, to say the least. She lowered her voice. Scott, what exactly have you gotten involved in? I wish I knew, but until I do, I need her somewhere safe. Molly nodded. I understand, but she needs consistency, familiar faces. Her condition worsens with major changes. Would you be willing to accompany her? Scott asked. Just temporarily. I know it's a lot to ask. Of course I would, Molly interrupted. Vera is my patient. I wouldn't abandon her when she needs stability most. Relief washed over Scott. Thank you. I'll make sure you're compensated for any inconvenience. Molly gave him a stern look. This isn't about money. Now let me help Vera. Prepare while you sort out the details. As Molly departed, Weber approached. We've secured a private medical facility in Willowbrook, complete staff, state-of-the-art security, fully equipped for dementia care. The helicopter can transport your mother and her caregiver immediately. What about her medical records, medications? Being handled as we speak. Mr. Armstrong has considerable resources at his disposal. Scott's phone buzzed with a text message from Diane. Need to talk. Have info about Kingsley's death, not suicide. Before he could respond, a second message arrived. Be careful who you trust. Meeting Armstrong. Scott stared at the screen, unnerved by Diane's apparent knowledge of his movements. He typed quickly, How do you know about Armstrong? Her response was immediate. Journalist, remember, meet me, St. James Hospital, room 412. Weber was watching him closely. Problem? Nothing urgent, Scott lied, pocketing his phone. Let's get my mother moved. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Vera's essential belongings were packed, medical records transferred, and arrangements made for her continued care. Through it all, Scott marveled at the efficiency money could buy. Problems that would have taken him weeks to solve were handled with a single phone call from Armstrong Construction. As the helicopter prepared to depart with Vera and Molly on board, Scott embraced his mother. "I'll visit soon," he promised. "The doctors say the lake view is beautiful." Vera patted his cheek, a moment of unusual clarity in her eyes. "You look just like your father when you're worried. He was a good man, always doing the right thing. Even when it was hard." Scott swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm trying, Mom. I know you are, sweetheart. That's why I worry about you." As the helicopter lifted off, Scott stood watching until it was just a speck against the blue sky. Weber approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Mr. Armstrong is expecting us at his office in Willowbrook." Scott turned to him. "I need to make a stop first." "Sir, Mr. Armstrong was very clear." "I'm not on his payroll," Scott interrupted firmly. "Not yet, anyway. I need to visit someone at St. James Hospital. It's relevant to all of this." Weber considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well. We'll take you there, but I'll need to accompany you inside." "Fine." The ride to St. James Hospital was tense and silent. Scott's mind raced with questions. Why would someone target his mother? What did Diane know about Kingsley's death? And most importantly, what did Louis Armstrong want from him after all these years? St. James was a sprawling medical complex in downtown Newport. As they walked through the main entrance, Scott noted Weber discreetly scanning the lobby. Ever, the security professional. Room 412 was on the orthopedic floor. Scott knocked gently on the partially open door. "Come in," Diane's voice called. She was propped up in bed, her injured leg elevated and heavily bandaged. Despite the hospital setting and her injuries, she looked alert and composed. Her notebook and a laptop arranged on the bedside table. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Weber behind Scott. "I see you brought company." "Security concerns," Scott explained vaguely. "How's the leg?" "Multiple fractures, some nerve damage. They're optimistic, but it'll be a long recovery." Diane gestured to the chair beside her bed. "Please sit. We have a lot to discuss." Scott sat while Weber positioned himself by the door, giving them a semblance of privacy while maintaining visual contact. "You said Kingsley's death wasn't suicide," Scott began without preamble. Diane lowered her voice. "I have a source in the police department. Kingsley was found in his home office, gun in hand, apparent self-inflicted wound to the temple. Except the angle was wrong for someone of his height, and there were signs of a struggle they're trying to keep quiet. Murder staged as suicide," Scott mused. "Why?" "The collapse accelerated a timeline," Diane replied. "I've been investigating Kingsley. For months, he's been cutting corners on buildings across Newport. But Oakwood Terrace was special. It was meant to be his legacy project, his architectural triumph. Instead, it became a death trap." "Exactly. But here's what you don't know. Kingsley wasn't working alone. He had partners, powerful ones, who helped him navigate around building codes, silence whistleblowers, and bury safety concerns." Scott leaned forward. "Hayes, the inspector. A small fish. I'm talking about people with real influence, judges, city officials, investors with international connections. And you think these partners silenced Kingsley before he could implicate them?" Diane nodded. "The collapse created too much scrutiny. Kingsley was the visible face, the acceptable sacrifice." Scott processed this, the pieces fitting with his own suspicions. "What does Armstrong have to do with all this?" Diane's expression turned guarded. "Louis Armstrong has a complicated history with Kingsley. Rivals in business, but occasionally partners when profitable. After Somerset Plaza, Armstrong distanced himself publicly, but my sources suggest they still had arrangements." "You think Armstrong was involved in the corner cutting?" "I don't know yet. But be careful, Scott. Armstrong reaching out immediately after Kingsley's death isn't coincidence. Webber cleared his throat from the doorway. Mr. Finley, we should be going. Mr. Armstrong is waiting. Scott stood reluctantly. I need to understand what's happening. People died yesterday because of Kingsley's greed, just like at Somerset Plaza. I have files, Diane said quickly. Documents linking Kingsley to several officials, including some communications about Somerset Plaza. She reached for a USB drive on her table. Webber stepped forward. Ms. Calloway, if you have evidence pertinent to an ongoing investigation, it should be turned over to the authorities. Diane's eyes narrowed. And which authorities would those be, Mr. Webber, head of security for Armstrong Construction? Exactly my point. She handed the USB drive to Scott. 4 people died at Somerset Plaza. 3 more yesterday at Oakwood. How many next time if the system doesn't change? Scott pocketed the drive, acutely aware of Webber's disapproving gaze. I'll look at these, and I'll be careful with Armstrong. One more thing, Diane called as Scott turned to leave. The night before the collapse, I observed Hayes meeting with someone from City Hall, the Deputy Commissioner of Urban Development. They argued about inspection schedules, expedited permits. It got heated. You think the Deputy Commissioner was pressuring Hayes or warning him? Either way, Hayes looked terrified afterward. Diane handed Scott a slip of paper. My private number, call me after you meet with Armstrong, and Scott, watch your back. Outside the hospital, Webber guided Scott to the waiting car, his expression professionally neutral despite the tense exchange they'd just left. Mr. Finley, I should advise you that engaging with journalists during sensitive matters is generally unwise. Noted, Scott replied curtly. Now let's go see what Armstrong wants. The drive to Willowbrook took them through the wealthiest suburbs of Newport, where manicured estates stood behind ornate gates and luxury vehicles lined curved driveways. Armstrong Construction's headquarters occupied a sprawling campus at the edge of the district, a showcase of modern architectural design with sweeping glass facades and sustainable landscaping. As they pulled up to the main building, Scott couldn't help but contrast this opulence with the squalid conditions of his Milltown apartment. This was the world he'd once been part of, before Somerset Plaza had cost him everything. Webber led him through a soaring atrium where employees in business attire moved purposefully beneath a massive sculpture representing human innovation. They took a private elevator to the top floor, where Armstrong's executive suite commanded views of the entire Newport skyline. Louis Armstrong was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows when they entered, his back to the door. At 60, he remained an imposing figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair perfectly styled, his bespoke suit emphasizing his athletic build. Scott, he said without turning. It's been a long time. 5 years, 2 months, Scott replied evenly. Not that I've been counting. Armstrong turned then, his expression unreadable. I deserve that, and probably much worse. He gestured to the seating area. Please sit. We have a great deal to discuss, and time is not on our side. Scott remained. Standing. Where's my mother? Settled comfortably at Lakeview Retreat, private room overlooking the water, 2 security personnel stationed discreetly. She's safe. Armstrong moved to his desk, pressing a button. I can arrange a video call if you'd like confirmation. Later, Scott decided, finally taking a seat. First, tell me why I'm here. Why the sudden interest in my welfare after 5 years of silence? Armstrong sat opposite him, folding his hands deliberately. Because Roland Kingsley is dead, and you're likely next on their list. Whose list? The same people who ensured you took the fall for Somerset Plaza. The same people who made Kingsley into Newport's real estate visionary while knowing he was cutting corners on every project. Armstrong leaned forward. The same people who are, right now, systematically eliminating everyone who could connect them to these building failures. And who exactly are these people? Scott asked, skepticism evident in his voice. That, Armstrong said gravely, is what we need to find out. Before they find you. Convenient timing, Scott observed, studying Armstrong's face for any sign of deception. You've had 5 years to clear my name, yet you reach out the day after another building collapses. Armstrong accepted the accusation with a slight nod. I deserve your suspicion. But consider this. Oakwood Terrace created a pattern. One building. Failure might be blamed on a single engineer. 2 failures with similar cut corners suggests systemic corruption. A convenient narrative for you, Scott countered. What was your testimony again? That I was overly ambitious, prone to risky design choices. A flash of discomfort crossed Armstrong's face. I said what I was told to say, what I was pressured to say. Pressured by whom? Armstrong walked to his desk, unlocking a drawer with a small key from his pocket. He withdrew a thick file folder. I started collecting evidence after Somerset Plaza, quietly, carefully. Names, transactions, irregular permit approvals. He placed the folder on the coffee table between them. Scott made no move to touch it. Why should I believe anything you say? Because they threatened Claire. Armstrong's voice tightened. My daughter. They made it clear what would happen if I didn't cooperate with their narrative. Scott remembered Claire Armstrong, talented, idealistic, just starting her architectural career when Somerset Plaza collapsed. Her father's protective instinct would have been a powerful lever, so you sacrificed my career to save Claire. Yes. Armstrong didn't attempt to soften the admission, and I've regretted it every day since. Scott finally opened the folder, finding meticulous documentation, financial records, meeting minutes, photographs of handwritten notes, evidence of a coordinated effort to bypass building regulations across multiple projects. This connects to Kingsley? Scott asked, examining a document detailing irregular payments to Milton Hayes. Kingsley was a frontman, connected, charismatic, the perfect public face. Behind him was a network of investors who prioritized profit margins above all else. They called themselves the Newport Development Consortium. Scott looked up sharply. I've heard that name. They were minority investors in Somerset Plaza. Not so minor, Armstrong corrected. They controlled enough to influence decisions while maintaining plausible deniability if things went wrong. He pointed to a name on one of the documents. Julian Maxwell, head of the consortium, Kingsley's primary backer and the man who likely ordered his death. Scott recognized the name, a philanthropist whose family had shaped Newport's skyline for generations. Maxwell has a reputation for charitable giving, urban renewal projects. The perfect cover for shady dealings. He keeps his hands clean while deploying people like Hayes and Kingsley. Scott continued scanning the documents, his engineering mind connecting patterns, identifying inconsistencies. Some of these signatures don't match the official permits I saw at Oakwood. Exactly. Forgeries, backdated approvals, inspections that never occurred. This is criminal conspiracy, Scott realized, far beyond cutting corners. And now they're cleaning house. Kingsley was the obvious fall guy, but anyone with knowledge is at risk. Hayes, certain contractors, possibly some city officials. Armstrong's gaze was steady. And you, Scott, you've publicly connected the dots between Somerset and Oakwood. Scott thought of the suspicious men at Sunset Haven, the too convenient timing of Kingsley's suicide. The danger felt suddenly viscerally real. What's your proposal, he asked, his hostility replaced by pragmatic focus. Join forces. Combine my evidence with what you know, what you observed at Oakwood. Build an irrefutable case against Maxwell and the consortium. Why not go to the police? Armstrong shook his head. Maxwell has connections throughout law enforcement. We'd be shut down before we began, and the evidence would mysteriously disappear. Federal authorities then. Eventually, yes. But we need A complete case first, one too substantial to bury. Scott considered this, his engineer's mind assessing angles, structural weaknesses in Armstrong's narrative. And your motivation? Pure altruism seems unlikely. A bitter smile crossed Armstrong's face. Maxwell threatened Claire again yesterday, suggested her architectural firm might face regulatory issues if she spoke about Oakwood's design flaws. This time, I'm choosing the right side. The mention of Claire shifted something in Scott's perception. Whatever Armstrong's past failures, his protective instinct toward his daughter seemed genuine. If we do this, Scott said carefully, it's on my terms. Complete transparency, no more secrets. Armstrong extended his hand. Agreed. Scott hesitated before shaking it, the contact bridging 5 years of bitterness. Where do we start? With Hayes. He's the weak link, a man caught between self-preservation and fear. After Kingsley's death, he'll be looking for protection. He's also the one who falsified the Oakwood inspections, Scott pointed out. Hardly a sympathetic witness, but a valuable one. Hayes has documentation on every substandard building in Newport. If we can turn him... Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock. Weber entered, his normally composed expression tense. Sir, there's a situation. Hayes was just found in his car at the Newport Marina. Gunshot wound. Police are calling it suicide. Armstrong and Scott exchanged alarmed glances. Another suicide? Scott asked grimly. They're accelerating their timeline, Armstrong murmured. We need to move quickly. Scott stood, adrenaline replacing exhaustion. I need to check on Diane. Calloway, she has evidence that could help us, and if they're eliminating witnesses, I'll send security to the hospital, Armstrong assured him. But first, we need you somewhere secure. My residence has appropriate safeguards. Scott shook his head. I work better independently, and if Maxwell has the reach you suggest, your house could be compromised. At least take Weber with you. Scott studied the security chief's stoic face, weighing the risk of trusting Armstrong's people against facing unknown threats alone. Fine, but I drive. The journey back to Newport passed in tense silence, Scott's thoughts racing between concern for Diane, worry about his mother, and wariness of his unexpected alliance with Armstrong. When they reached St. James Hospital, an unsettling scene greeted them. Police vehicles clustered near the entrance, officers taking statements from staff. Scott approached the reception desk, an uneasy-feeling building. I'm here to see Diane. Calloway, room 412. The receptionist's expression confirmed his fears before she spoke. I'm sorry, sir, but Ms. Calloway is no longer in that room. Has she been moved? I can't provide patient information. You'll need to speak with hospital administration or the police officers. Weber flashed credentials that Scott couldn't quite see. Armstrong Security, working with Newport PD. What happened to Ms. Calloway? The receptionist hesitated, then lowered her voice. There was an incident. Someone entered her room posing as hospital staff. Security intervened, but there was a struggle. Scott's heart sank. Is she... She's alive, the receptionist clarified quickly, but she's been moved to a secure location within the hospital. No visitors without police clearance. Relief washed over Scott, followed immediately by grim understanding. The cleanup was expanding, growing more brazen. They were attacking in broad daylight now in a crowded hospital. Weber guided Scott back outside before he could press for more information. This confirms Armstrong's assessment. The timeline has accelerated. We need to get to Hayes' office before they clean it out, Scott decided. There might be evidence. They haven't secured yet. The police will have sealed it. Not if his death was just discovered. We have a small window. The Newport Building Inspection Department occupied a drab government building downtown. Scott and Weber arrived to find it operating normally. No police tape, no signs that Hayes' death had impacted operations yet. "Follow my lead," Weber instructed, straightening his tie, "and try to look official." They approached the front desk with purposeful strides. Weber once again produced credentials. "Armstrong Construction Security. We need access to Milton Hayes' office. Mr. Armstrong had an appointment regarding the Oakwood Terrace situation." The receptionist, a harried-looking woman in her 50s, barely glanced at the credentials. "Mr. Hayes hasn't come in today. No one can find him. That's why we're here," Weber replied smoothly. "There's been an incident. We need to secure certain documents related to ongoing investigations." She hesitated. "I'm not supposed to allow access without authorization." "Perhaps you could call Director Sanders," Weber suggested, dropping the name of the department head with casual confidence. "He's expecting us." The bluff worked. Rather than risk bothering her superior, the receptionist buzzed them through. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Hayes' office was small and cluttered, walls lined with building, code manuals and filing cabinets. His desk overflowed with permits, inspection reports and technical drawings. "Start with his computer," Scott suggested, moving toward the filing cabinets. "Look for anything related to Oakwood Terrace or Somerset Plaza." Weber nodded, seating himself at Hayes' desk and beginning to search the system. Scott rifled through file drawers, quickly skimming documents for relevant information. In the third drawer, beneath routine paperwork, Scott discovered a sealed envelope labeled simply "Insurance." Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. "If anything happens to me, give this to Scott Finley." "Hayes knew he was in danger," Scott murmured, pocketing the drive. "And he knew I'd be looking." Weber glanced up from the computer. "Nothing obvious here. Everything sensitive would likely be on encrypted drives or personal devices." A noise in the hallway alerted them. Voices approaching, authoritative footsteps. Scott quickly rearranged the files to hide their search. "Time to go," Weber whispered, shutting down the computer. "Back exit?" Scott pointed to a door partially hidden behind a filing cabinet. "Service corridor. Should lead to the parking garage." They slipped out just as the office door opened, catching a glimpse of uniformed officers entering. The service corridor was dimly lit and narrow, leading to a stairwell that descended to the underground parking facility. "That was close," Scott observed as they reached Weber's car. "Too close to be coincidence." "Someone at the reception desk must have made a call," Weber agreed, starting the engine. "Where to now?" Scott withdrew Hayes' USB drive. "Somewhere I can review this safely. Not Armstrong's office, not my apartment." After consideration, he directed Weber to a public library. In a middle-class Newport neighborhood, neutral ground, with private study rooms and computer access. They secured a small room at the back of the building, away from windows and foot traffic. The USB drive contained hundreds of files, inspection reports, emails, photographs of construction sites, including both Somerset Plaza and Oakwood Terrace. Hayes had been methodical in documenting the corners that were cut, the safety regulations ignored. He was building a case, Scott realized, examining a folder of emails between Hayes and Kingsley. Insurance, just like the envelope said. Protection against being the sole scapegoat. One document particularly caught Scott's attention, a memo from Julian Maxwell to Kingsley regarding Somerset Plaza, dated just days before the collapse. It explicitly directed Kingsley to proceed with the modified design regardless of Finley's objections, and to ensure Armstrong's cooperation through appropriate channels. "This vindicates you," Weber observed, reading over Scott's shoulder. "Proves you warned them about the structural issues, and that Armstrong was pressured to testify against me." Scott continued scrolling through documents, finding more evidence of Maxwell's direct involvement in decisions that prioritized cost-cutting over safety. A text message interrupted their research. An unknown number. Hospital security compromised. Diane Calloway taken, not by police. Scott showed Weber the message. "How would anyone know to text me about Diane?" "It could be a trap," Weber warned, "or someone inside the hospital who knows you visited her." Before Scott could respond, another message arrived from the same number. "Maxwell's men headed to your location. Library not safe, rooftop parking, black van, 5 minutes." Weber was immediately on alert, drawing a concealed handgun. "We need to move. Now." "Wait," Scott cautioned, staring at the message. "How would they know we're at the library? No one followed us." The realization hit them simultaneously. Scott turned to Weber, whose expression had shifted from alert to calculating. "You're not Armstrong's security chief, are you?" Weber's posture changed subtly, his grip on the weapon adjusting. "Not exactly." "You work for Maxwell." "I work for whoever pays best," Weber corrected, his professional demeanor now tinged with menace. "Currently, that's the consortium. Armstrong's a fool, thinking he could protect you with one security team." He gestured with the gun. "Let's go. Quietly." Scott assessed his options. The small study room offered no escape routes, no weapons, no advantages. "Where are you taking me?" "Maxwell wants to talk. Explain the New World Order, the one where buildings collapse and people die for profit margins." Weber shrugged. "Development requires sacrifice. You should know that better than most." Scott slowly raised his hands, mind racing for some advantage. "And Diane, where is she?" "Asking similar questions, I imagine. Now move." Weber guided Scott through the library's back exit toward the parking structure, maintaining a professional distance that wouldn't alarm casual observers. Scott walked deliberately, cataloging every detail of their surroundings: the distance to stairwells, the positions of security cameras, the rhythm of Weber's movements. As they approached the parking structure, Scott spotted a black van with tinted windows idling near the upper-level entrance, exactly as the text had described. The pieces suddenly connected. The text wasn't a warning, Scott realized aloud. It was instructions for you. Weber's slight smile confirmed it. "Very observant. Keep moving." They were 10 yards from the van when Scott made his decision. Utilizing skills from years of physical labor, he abruptly pivoted, driving his elbow into Weber's solar plexus with construction-hardened strength. The security chief doubled over, momentarily losing his grip on the weapon. Scott didn't hesitate, wresting the gun away and sprinting toward the library's main entrance. Behind him, he heard Weber shouting, the van's engine revving. Ahead, through the glass doors, he saw a familiar figure climbing out of a taxi. Claire Armstrong was rushing toward the library, phone in hand, face drawn with urgency. Their eyes met through the glass, just as Scott heard footsteps pounding behind him. In that split second, Scott made his choice. Not the van, not Weber, but a third option he hadn't anticipated. Claire Armstrong had come looking for him, and that changed everything. Scott burst through the library doors, grabbing Claire's arm without breaking stride. "Run! Weber's working for Maxwell." To her credit, Claire didn't waste time questioning him. She pivoted immediately, sprinting alongside Scott toward her taxi. The driver, startled by their urgency, was halfway out of his seat when they reached the vehicle. "Drive!" Claire commanded, throwing herself into the back seat with Scott right behind her. "Now!" The taxi lurched forward, just as Weber emerged from the library, gun now openly displayed. He fired once, the bullet shattering the rear window as they accelerated away. "Jesus Christ," the driver shouted, ducking instinctively while maintaining control of the vehicle. What the hell was that? Police matter. Claire flashed what looked like a badge. "Keep driving. Turn right at the next intersection." The driver complied, weaving through traffic with newfound purpose. Scott glanced back to see Weber running toward the black van. "They'll follow," he warned, checking Weber's gun, a standard 9mm with a half-full magazine. "How did you find me?" Dad called. "Said you'd gone off with Weber against his advice." Claire's expression was taut with tension. "Said his security team discovered Weber had unauthorized communications with unknown parties. A bit late on that." Discovery, Scott muttered, directing the driver to make another turn. Weber was delivering me to Maxwell. They have Diane Calloway, too. Claire's eyes widened. The journalist? How do you know? Scott showed her the text messages. Weber confirmed it. This was a coordinated capture operation. He leaned forward to address the driver. Sir, I apologize for involving you in this. If you could drop us at the next shopping center, we'll find alternative transportation. The driver, a middle-aged man with military short hair, met Scott's eyes in the rearview mirror. Former Marine Corps, sir. I can stay with you if needed. Scott exchanged a glance with Claire. The offer was tempting, but that's very generous. But this situation is dangerous. Better if you distance yourself after dropping us off. 5 minutes later, they were hurrying through a busy shopping mall, putting as many people between themselves and potential pursuers as possible. Scott had tucked Weber's gun into his waistband, covered by his jacket, aware of the security cameras tracking their movements. We need somewhere safe to examine Hayes's evidence, Scott said, as they navigated through afternoon shoppers, and to contact your father. Claire led him to a service corridor and through an unmarked door that required an access code. Inside was a small security office with monitoring equipment and a desktop computer. The firm I work for designed this mall's security system, she explained, locking the door behind them. All senior architects have emergency access codes. She gestured to the computer. It's isolated from the main network. Should be safe to use. Scott inserted Hayes's USB drive while Claire contacted her father through an encrypted messaging app on her phone. Dad's sending a legitimate security team, she reported. He says to stay put until they arrive. We don't have time to wait, Scott argued, already examining the files on Hayes's drive. Maxwell's people have Diane, and they're cleaning up loose ends rapidly. What exactly did you find at Hayes's office? Scott showed her the document linking Maxwell directly to Somerset Plaza's failure. Claire read it carefully, her professional composure cracking as she absorbed its implications. This exonerates you completely, she whispered. 5 years too late. It's not just about clearing my name anymore. It's about stopping them before more buildings fail and more people die. As Scott continued searching through files, a particular folder caught his attention, labeled simply P18. Inside were blueprints, soil analysis reports, and structural specifications for a massive development project. Parkview Heights, an 18-tower residential and commercial complex under construction on Newport's east side. Claire, look at this. Scott pointed to specific modifications in the foundation designs. They're using the same substandard concrete mixture as Oakwood Terrace, but at a much larger scale. And these support columns... Claire leaned in, her architectural expertise engaging immediately. They've reduced the steel reinforcement by almost 30% from code requirements. Her face paled. Scott, this complex is designed to house thousands of people. If it fails, it would be catastrophic. Scott checked the construction timeline, and according to this, they've already completed the first 3 towers. People are living there right now. The implications settled heavily between them, not just past failures to be exposed, but an imminent disaster to be prevented. This is why they're eliminating witnesses, Scott realized. Not just to cover past crimes, but to protect their biggest project yet. Claire was already typing on her phone. Dad needs to see this immediately. We need building inspectors, structural engineers. Maxwell controls the inspection process, Scott reminded her. And going public without overwhelming evidence would give them time to cover their tracks, or worse. A thought struck him. The Deputy Commissioner of Urban Development, Diane said Hayes met with him the night before the collapse. He might have been warning Hayes. James Reeves? Claire looked up sharply. He's known for being incorruptible, a thorn in developers' sides for years. If he suspected problems with Oakwood, he might know about Parkview too. Scott checked his watch. We need to find him before Maxwell's people do. Claire pulled up the city government directory on her phone. His office is at City Hall, but at this hour he's likely at the Planning Commission meeting at Garrison Hall. And man, you get us there undetected? Better than that, Claire replied, a determined glint in her eye. I can get us into the meeting. I'm scheduled to present architectural plans for a community center renovation. The security team Armstrong had promised arrived 15 minutes later. 3 professionals who thoroughly vetted the mall's perimeter before escorting Scott and Claire to an unmarked vehicle with tinted windows. Ms. Armstrong, your father requested. We take you both directly to his residence, the lead agent informed them. Change of plans, Claire responded firmly. We need to get to Garrison Hall immediately. The Planning Commission meeting. The security team exchanged glances. Sir, we strongly advise against public appearances given the current threat level. Scott understood their concern but couldn't shake the urgency gnawing at him. Every minute they delayed meant more potential victims, more buildings at risk, more witnesses in danger. I appreciate the advice, he said, but thousands of lives may depend on reaching Deputy Commissioner Reeves before Maxwell's people silence him. Your job is to get us there safely. The lead agent made a quick call, presumably to Armstrong, before nodding reluctantly. We'll establish a secure perimeter and escort you directly to Reeves, but we don't linger. The drive to Garrison Hall was tense, all eyes scanning for the black van or any other signs of surveillance. The grand neoclassical building housed various government offices and meeting spaces, its formal architecture projecting permanence and stability. Qualities Scott now knew were dangerously illusory in Newport's development landscape. The Planning Commission meeting was underway in the main chamber, with various architects and developers making presentations to the board. Claire's security credentials and scheduled presentation gave them immediate access, though Scott noticed the security team's discomfort at entering such an exposed public space. Deputy Commissioner James Reeves sat at the center of the commission panel, a serious man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Scott studied him, trying to discern if this was truly a potential ally or another player in Maxwell's network. Claire approached the commission secretary, whispering urgently. The woman nodded, making a note on her tablet. Ms. Armstrong will present after the current speaker, she announced to a colleague. Scott positioned himself near the side entrance, flanked by Armstrong's security team, scanning the room for potential threats. His attention caught on a familiar face in the audience, the younger of the 2 men who had been asking about his mother at Sunset Haven. The man was watching the proceedings with apparent disinterest, but his posture betrayed alertness beyond that of an ordinary citizen. Potential hostile, 3 o'clock blue suit, Scott murmured to the security lead. He was at my mother's care facility this morning. The agent nodded imperceptibly, communicating silently with his team members. One casually repositioned himself for a better angle on the identified threat. Claire was called to the podium, her presentation materials appearing on the large screen behind the commission. Instead of community center plans, however, she displayed the Parkview Heights Foundation specifications from Hayes's files. Commissioners, I apologize for the substitution, but a matter of public safety takes precedence over scheduled business, she began, her professional demeanor commanding attention. These are the current foundation specifications for Parkview Heights, the largest residential development in Newport's history. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Reeves leaned forward, suddenly alert. These specifications reveal critical deviations from building code requirements, Claire continued, highlighting specific sections. Similar deviations directly caused yesterday's collapse at Oakwood Terrace. The commission chairman, a florid man with an expensive tie, attempted to interrupt. Ms. Armstrong, this is highly irregular. If you have concerns about ongoing projects, there are proper channels. With respect, sir, Claire cut in, those channels have been compromised. Building Inspector Milton Hayes, who raised concerns about these specifications, was found dead this morning. Developer Roland Kingsley likewise. The room erupted in shocked conversations. Scott noticed the man in the blue suit rising, hand moving subtly toward his jacket. One of Armstrong's security team intercepted, blocking his path to the exit with a seemingly casual movement. Deputy Commissioner Reeves raised his hand for silence. Ms. Armstrong, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you have evidence beyond these specifications? We do, Claire confirmed, glancing towards Scott. Evidence linking these code violations to Julian Maxwell and the Newport Development Consortium. At Maxwell's name, Reeves's expression hardened. He turned to the chairman. I move we clear the room and continue this discussion in closed session immediately. James, this is hardly the venue for... People are living in those towers, Henry. Reeves snapped. If what Ms. Armstrong is suggesting is true, we don't have time for bureaucratic niceties. The chairman reluctantly called for a recess, instructing all non-essential personnel to leave the chamber. As the audience filed out, Scott observed the man in the blue suit being quietly detained by Armstrong's security team. Meanwhile, Reeves approached Claire with urgent purpose. My office now, he directed, leading them through a side door into a secure corridor. Once inside his private office, Reeves locked the door and activated what appeared to be a signal jammer. You've made some powerful enemies today, he said. Gravely. Maxwell doesn't appreciate public scrutiny. You know about Maxwell's operations? Scott asked directly. Reeves studied him. Scott Finley, the engineer from Somerset Plaza. He nodded slowly. I've been building a case against Maxwell for years. Hayes was one of my sources before he lost his nerve. The night before Oakwood collapsed, Claire prompted. Hayes met with you. He was terrified, Reeves confirmed. Said Maxwell's people were pressuring him to approve Parkview despite critical structural issues. I convinced him to document everything, to help me build a federal case. Too late for Hayes, Scott observed grimly. And they have Diane Calloway now, too. Reeves's eyebrows rose. The journalist? When? Taken from the hospital within the last 2 hours. Maxwell's cleaning house before Parkview can be exposed. The deputy commissioner moved to his computer, typing rapidly. I've been documenting irregularities in permit approvals, inspections, materials testing, building the case methodically, waiting for enough evidence to bring in federal authorities without giving Maxwell's political connections time to intervene. We don't have time for methodical anymore, Scott insisted. Those towers are occupied. If they fail like Oakwood, I understand the urgency, Mr. Finley. Reeves turned his screen to show them evacuation plans, structural assessment protocols, federal agency contacts. I've had contingencies prepared. I just needed irrefutable evidence linking Maxwell directly to the code violations. Scott withdrew Hayes's USB drive. Like this? As Reeves examined the files, his office phone rang. He answered cautiously, listening, for a moment before his expression darkened. When? How many units? Another pause. Evacuate immediately. Full protocol. I'm on my way. He hung up, turning to Scott and Claire with grim determination. Hairline cracks have appeared in the support columns of Parkview Tower 1. Residents reported unusual settling sensations, movement in the floors. Scott felt the blood drain from his face. It's starting already. We're implementing emergency evacuation procedures, but we need to move quickly. The evidence you've brought may be enough to secure federal intervention. Reeves gathered his coat and briefcase. We'll take my security detail. The federal prosecutor has agreed to meet us. At the site? As they moved toward the door, Reeves paused, fixing Scott with an evaluative gaze. 5 years ago, I tried to investigate the irregularities at Somerset Plaza. I was blocked at every turn. Perhaps today we can finally deliver the justice you... Deserved then. Scott wasn't interested in personal vindication anymore. Justice won't matter if those towers come down with people inside. Let's move. They exited through a secure corridor, Reeves's security team forming a protective formation around them. As they emerged into the parking garage, Scott caught a glimpse of flashing emergency lights already visible in the direction of Newport's east side, where Parkview Heights stood as a monument to greed, corruption, and impending disaster. The race to save thousands of lives had begun, with Scott Finley, once blamed for tragedy, now positioned to prevent a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Diane, he remembered suddenly. We can't leave her. In Maxwell's hands. One crisis at a time, Mr. Finley, Reeves counseled as they entered his armored vehicle. First, we evacuate those towers. Then we bring down Maxwell and find your journalist. As the vehicle accelerated toward Parkview Heights, Scott checked Weber's gun, ensuring it was ready if needed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Yesterday, he had been a simple construction worker, worried about paying his mother's care bills. Today, he was racing to prevent a disaster that could reshape Newport's skyline and expose corruption at the city's highest levels. And somewhere in the chaos, Diane Calloway was being held by the very people they were about to confront. Parkview Heights dominated Newport's eastern skyline, 18 towers in various stages of completion, the first 3 already occupied with gleaming glass facades, reflecting the late afternoon sun. Under different circumstances, Scott might have admired the architectural ambition. Now, he saw only the looming potential for catastrophe. As Reeves's vehicle approached, the scene ahead confirmed their worst fears. Emergency vehicles surrounded Tower 1, lights flashing as residents streamed from the building with hastily gathered possessions. Police officers directed traffic while firefighters coordinated the evacuation. How many people in these first 3 towers? Scott asked, surveying the increasingly chaotic scene. Approximately 1,200, Reeves replied grimly. Tower. One has 300 units, mostly occupied. Their vehicle was waved through the police barricade, coming to a stop at the emergency command center established near the building's main entrance. Fire Chief Martin was coordinating teams, his weathered face tight with concentration. James, he acknowledged as Reeves approached. Evacuation is 60% complete. We're clearing floor by floor, starting from the top. Status of the structure, Reeves asked. Deteriorating. Building safety engineer reports increasing pressure on the support columns. Cracks widening on floors 8 through 12. Scott stepped forward. I'd like to examine those support columns personally. The fire chief assessed Scott skeptically. And you are? Scott Finley, structural engineer. I identified the same issues at Oakwood Terrace before its collapse. Recognition dawned in Martin's eyes. The construction worker who saved those people yesterday. He gestured to a woman in a safety vest and hard hat. Dr. Garcia, our structural assessment lead. She'll take you in. Dr. Elena Garcia, a focused woman in her 40s, briefed Scott as they donned safety equipment. We've installed monitoring devices on the primary support columns. Stress indicators show concerning patterns similar to pre-failure conditions. How long until potential collapse? Scott asked as they entered the building, moving against the flow of evacuating residents. Current models suggest 4 to 6 hours before critical failure in Tower 1. She led him to a service corridor where exposed concrete columns revealed exactly what Scott had feared, the same substandard mixture and inadequate reinforcement he'd noted at Oakwood. Scott examined the widening cracks, recognizing patterns identical to those he'd documented before Somerset Plaza's failure. These cracks are propagating faster than your models suggest, he observed, measuring a particularly concerning fissure. The rain yesterday would have accelerated the deterioration process. He traced a finger along a hairline crack that hadn't been marked yet. You need to look at the connection points between these columns and the horizontal support beams. That's where the failure at Oakwood initiated. Dr. Garcia directed her team to the indicated areas, their instruments confirming Scott's assessment. "You're right. The stress patterns are accelerating." She turned to her radio. "Command, revise evacuation timeline." Structure showing accelerated deterioration patterns consistent with imminent failure. "How imminent?" came the terse reply. Scott took the radio. "This is Finley. I'd estimate 2 hours, maximum. And you need to expand the evacuation zone to include towers 2 and 3. If they use the same materials and methods, they're equally compromised." "Understood. Expanding evacuation perimeter now." As they exited the building, Scott noticed increasing media presence. News vans, reporters with cameras, helicopters circling overhead. The evacuation was becoming a major news event, which meant Maxwell would know his project was under scrutiny. Claire and Reeves were conferring with a serious-looking woman in a tailored suit when Scott rejoined them. "Scott, this is Federal Prosecutor Andrea Chambers," Claire introduced. "She's reviewing the evidence against Maxwell and the consortium." Chambers assessed Scott with sharp eyes. "Mr. Finley, Deputy Commissioner Reeves has explained your connection to this case. The evidence you've provided is compelling, particularly Hayes's documentation." "Is it enough for immediate action against Maxwell?" Scott asked directly. "It's enough for search warrants and freezing of certain assets," Chambers confirmed. "My team is preparing to move on Maxwell's offices and residence within the hour." "He'll destroy evidence," Scott warned. "And he still has Diane Calloway." Chambers nodded. "We're coordinating with local police for simultaneous raids on all known consortium properties. As for Ms. Calloway, we've put out an alert, but without knowing her specific location." "I might," Claire interrupted, showing them her phone. "Dad's security team traced the last signal from Diane's phone. It pinged from a warehouse near the marina, owned by a Maxwell shell company." Scott felt a surge of hope. "That's where Weber was taking me. It makes sense they'd bring Diane there, too. I can redirect resources for a search," Chambers offered, already typing on her phone. "There's no time," Scott insisted. "If Maxwell realizes the full extent of what's happening, Diane becomes a liability rather than leverage. I need to go now." "Scott, it's too dangerous," Claire argued. "Let the professionals handle it." "I'm going with or without approval," Scott replied firmly, "but I'd prefer to have support." Reeves exchanged glances with Chambers before nodding. Reluctantly, "I can spare 2 officers from my security detail, but you follow their lead, understand? No heroics." "What about the towers?" Claire asked, looking toward the evacuation efforts. "Dr. Garcia's team will continue monitoring," Reeves assured her. "And we've initiated emergency procedures for all Parkview buildings. The priority now is gathering all possible evidence against Maxwell before he can destroy it." While Chambers coordinated the federal response, Reeves assigned 2 experienced security officers to accompany Scott to the marina warehouse. Officer Jenkins, a compact woman with 15 years of tactical experience, and Officer Ramirez, former military with specialized extraction training. "We go in quietly," Jenkins instructed as they drove toward the marina district. "Reconnaissance first, then develop an extraction plan. No engagement unless absolutely necessary." "Understood," Scott agreed, checking Weber's gun once more, a habit that was becoming disturbingly familiar. The warehouse sat at the industrial end of Newport's marina, a nondescript concrete structure surrounded by similar buildings. From their observation point across the street, they identified 2 guards at the main entrance and surveillance cameras covering all apparent access points. "Too well secured for a simple storage facility," Ramirez observed. "Definitely something valuable inside." Jenkins studied the building through binoculars. "Service entrance on the east side appears less monitored. We could—" She stopped abruptly as a sleek black car approached the warehouse. The vehicle paused at the security gate, then proceeded inside after a brief exchange. "That's Maxwell." Scott recognized the silver-haired figure in the back seat. Why would he come personally unless something critical was happening? Whatever it is, it's accelerating our timeline, Jenkins decided. If he's here to tie up loose ends, the implication hung heavily in the air. Diane might have very little time left. Jenkins outlined a rapid approach plan using the limited cover available. They would access the building through a loading dock that showed intermittent activity, timing their entry between security patrols. The approach went smoothly, with Jenkins disabling a security camera while Ramirez secured their entry point. Inside, the warehouse was divided into sections: general storage in the front, offices along one wall, and a separate secure area at the rear. They moved silently through the shadows between shipping crates, pausing as voices echoed from the secured section. Scott recognized Weber's distinctive cadence, followed by Maxwell's more cultured tones. "Complete disaster," Maxwell was saying. "The evacuation, the federal prosecutor. Someone's been collecting evidence." "We've contained most loose ends," Weber replied. "Hayes's files were mostly secured, and with Kingsley gone, yet somehow they knew exactly where to look." Maxwell's voice rose in uncharacteristic agitation. "The Planning Commission meeting was a catastrophe. They have the Parkview specifications." Scott gestured toward a partially open door where the voices originated. Jenkins nodded, signaling Scott and Ramirez to maintain position while she established a better vantage point. "What about the journalist?" Maxwell demanded. "Still being questioned," Weber reported. "She refuses to reveal her sources or what evidence she's shared. Typical journalist bravado." "We don't have time for traditional methods," Maxwell decided. "Prepare for immediate relocation. All assets, all personnel. The boats are standing by." "And the journalist?" A chilling pause. "Loose ends, Mr. Weber. I thought I made that clear." Jenkins returned to their position, mouth set in a grim line. "They're holding Calloway in an office at the back, 2 guards plus Weber and Maxwell. They're planning to move soon, and it sounds like they don't intend for her to survive the transition." "We need to move now," Scott insisted. Ramirez checked his weapon. "Agreed. We go in hard and fast. Jenkins, you secure the exit route. Finley, and I will extract Calloway." "Wait," Scott urged, an idea forming. "I have a better way." 2 minutes later, Scott walked openly toward the warehouse office, hands visible, Weber's gun left behind with Jenkins. A calculated risk, but one that played to their unexpected advantage. Maxwell's desire to tie up loose ends personally. The guards spotted him immediately, weapons raising. "I'm unarmed," Scott called calmly. "Tell Maxwell that Scott Finley wants to talk terms." The guards exchanged confused glances before one spoke into his radio. Moments later, Weber emerged, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicious satisfaction. "Finley, coming to us saves time, I suppose." "I want to see Diane," Scott stated firmly. "Then we can discuss arrangements with Maxwell." Weber studied him skeptically. "Convenient timing, almost as if you knew our schedule." "The evacuation of Parkview made your timeline obvious," Scott replied smoothly. "Maxwell needs to disappear, but he needs insurance. I'm offering a better option than a journalist who won't talk." Weber considered this before nodding slightly. "Against the wall, standard search procedure." Scott complied as Weber patted him down, finding no weapons. "Clean. Let's go. But understand, one wrong move and this ends badly for both you and Ms. Calloway." Weber led Scott through the warehouse to the office section, where Maxwell waited in what appeared to be an improvised command center. Multiple screens displayed news feeds of the Parkview evacuation, police movements, and what looked like boat navigation systems. Julian Maxwell cut an impressive figure despite the circumstances. Tall, distinguished, his tailored clothing and silver hair projecting authority even as his world collapsed around him. He regarded Scott with cold calculation. "Mr. Finley, the persistence of cockroaches always astounds me." "Where's Diane?" Scott demanded, ignoring the insult. Maxwell gestured casually to a door at the rear of the office, collecting her thoughts. "She'll be joining our little exodus shortly, though not for the entire journey." "I'm offering an alternative," Scott stated. "The authorities don't have everything yet. There are still pieces of evidence only I know about. Insurance policies from both Kingsley and Hayes." This caught Maxwell's attention. "What specifically?" "Offshore. Account numbers. Financial transfers that directly link you to the substandard materials at both Somerset and Oakwood. Material that wasn't on Hayes's drive." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "And why would you offer this information to me rather than the authorities?" "Because I want two things more than I want justice," Scott replied, allowing bitterness to color his tone. "My reputation restored and my mother's security guaranteed. You can still provide both with your resources, even from wherever you're disappearing to." "A pragmatist after all," Maxwell observed, seeming almost impressed. "Perhaps I misjudged. You, Mr. Finley? I assumed you were burdened with the same tedious moral compass that made Armstrong so difficult to manage. 5 years of watching my career and life destroyed cured me of idealism," Scott responded, selling the deception with details from his actual experience. "I just want what I'm owed." Maxwell studied him silently, weighing the offer against his suspicions. Finally, he nodded to Weber. "Bring Ms. Calloway. Let's conclude all our business at once." When the door opened, Scott struggled to maintain his composure. Diane was escorted in by a guard, her face bruised, one arm held awkwardly against her body. Despite her injuries, her eyes blazed with defiance until she saw Scott. Confusion, then hurt, flashed across her features. "You," she whispered, the single word laden with accusation. "Working with them?" Scott avoided her gaze, playing his role. "Just making practical arrangements." "Fascinating reunions aside," Maxwell interrupted, "time is short. These alleged financial records, Mr. Finley, where are they?" "Secured with instructions for release if anything happens to me," Scott replied, stalling as he positioned himself between Diane and the nearest guard. "I need to verify Diane will be released unharmed before I provide access." Maxwell laughed without humor. "You're hardly in a position to make demands." "I'm offering a clean resolution," Scott insisted. "The records in exchange for our safe passage. Diane has certain evidence as well, insurance she arranged before being taken. This was a calculated gamble. If Maxwell believed both of them had distributed evidence, killing them became pointless. The damage would already be done." The gambit seemed to work. Maxwell considered briefly before nodding. "Very well. The specifics of these records?" As Scott began fabricating convincing details about offshore transfers, he caught Diane's eye, giving an almost imperceptible nod toward the door. Her expression remained accusatory, but he detected the slightest shift as understanding dawned. Scott was 3 minutes into his elaborate fiction when the warehouse lights suddenly cut out, plunging the office into darkness. Emergency lighting activated seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. In that moment of confusion, Scott lunged toward Diane, shoving her down as Ramirez burst through the door, weapon raised. Jenkins simultaneously entered from another access point, creating a perfect tactical crossfire. "Federal agents!" Jenkins shouted. "Everyone down, hands where I can see them!" Weber reacted instantly, drawing his weapon. Ramirez fired once, the shot striking Weber's shoulder and sending him crashing into a desk. The other guards, caught off guard by the professional assault, hesitated fatally before being subdued by Jenkins. Maxwell alone remained composed, slowly raising his hands with the weary resignation of a man who had calculated all possible outcomes and found his position. "Untenable, Ms. Calloway," he said conversationally, as if they were at a business meeting. "I do hope you'll mention in your eventual article that I conducted myself with dignity when the end came." Scott helped Diane to her feet, checking her injuries. "Are you okay?" "Been better," she managed, wincing as she straightened. "How did you find me?" "Long story," Scott replied, relief washing over him. "But it ends with Maxwell in custody and evidence that will put him away for decades." Jenkins secured Maxwell while Ramirez called for backup and medical assistance. Outside, sirens approached. The coordinated federal raid Scott had discussed with Chambers was converging on the warehouse. As they led Maxwell out, the businessman paused beside Scott. "You know, Mr. Finley, in another life, we might have been associates. You have a surprisingly practical mind beneath that tedious conscience." "In another life," Scott agreed coldly, "you might have been someone who valued human lives more than profit margins." Maxwell smiled thinly. "Always a matter of perspective. The towers would have stood for decades." "Until they didn't," Scott replied. "Until they collapsed like Oakwood and killed hundreds. That's not perspective, Maxwell. That's criminal negligence." As federal agents took custody of Maxwell and his associates, Scott's phone rang. Claire calling with urgent news. "Scott, where are you? Is Diane safe?" "She's here, injured but alive." "Maxwell's in custody." "Thank God." Relief colored Claire's voice. "But you need to get back to Parkview immediately. Tower 1's deterioration is accelerating faster than predicted. Dr. Garcia estimates less than 40 minutes until potential collapse." Scott's momentary triumph evaporated. Evacuation status. Still approximately 50 residents unaccounted for, mostly elderly or disabled residents who need assistance. And Scott... She hesitated. "Dad's in there. He went in with the rescue teams to help coordinate when they were short-staffed." The news hit Scott like a physical blow. Despite their complicated history, Armstrong had ultimately sided with the truth, had protected his mother, had facilitated everything that led to Maxwell's capture. "I'm on my way," he promised, already moving toward the exit. "Keep the structural assessment team focused on the primary support junctions on floors 8 through 12. That's where failure will initiate." As Scott hurried out with Diane limping beside him, emergency vehicles converged on the warehouse. In the distance, Parkview Heights rose against the darkening sky, Tower 1's gleaming facade masking the deadly flaws within its structure. Flaws that threatened to bring the entire building crashing down, with Louis Armstrong still inside. The scene at Parkview Heights had transformed from organized evacuation to barely controlled chaos. As Scott arrived with Diane, emergency vehicles clogged access roads while police struggled to maintain an expanding perimeter. Floodlights illuminated Tower 1 against the evening sky, making the hairline cracks in its facade visible even from a distance. "Finley!" Fire Chief Martin waved him over to the command center, where Dr. Garcia was reviewing structural monitoring data with increasing alarm. "The north-facing support columns on level 10 have shifted another 3 centimeters, she reported, pointing to real-time measurements on her tablet. "We've got compression failures starting in the central core." Scott examined the data, the familiar patterns confirming his worst fears. "How many people still inside?" 23, Martin answered grimly. "Mostly elderly residents from the upper floors. Armstrong and a team of firefighters are assisting with the final evacuations." "What's their location?" "Floors 16 through 20. They're working their way down, but several residents require special evacuation equipment." Scott studied the architectural schematics spread across the command table. "If the support columns on 10 fail, everything above will pancake downward. They need to move faster or find an alternative evacuation route." "The helicopter was attempting rooftop evacuations," Martin explained, "but the building's movement made it too dangerous to continue." Claire approached, her professional composure strained by worry. Dad's not responding to calls. Last contact was 10 minutes ago from the 18th floor. Scott made a rapid decision. I'm going in. I know exactly how this structure will fail, because I've seen it before. I can help guide them to safety before the critical junctures collapse. Absolutely not, Martin objected. The building is red-tagged. No additional personnel. Those support columns will fail in less than 30 minutes, Scott insisted. Your team doesn't know what to look for. What subtle signs precede catastrophic failure? I do, Dr. Garcia intervened. He's right. Finley correctly identified failure patterns that our instruments missed. His expertise could be the difference. After a tense moment, Martin relented. 5 minutes to gear up. Take Thompson with you. He knows the building layout and has rescue equipment. As Scott prepared, Diane approached, despite medical personnel attempting to treat her injuries. You're going back into another collapsing building. Her tone mixed admiration with disbelief, occupational hazard apparently. Scott secured his safety helmet. When this is over, Diane said, holding his gaze, I'm writing the full story, Somerset. Plaza, Maxwell, Oakwood Terrace, everything. The world needs to know what happened. If I don't make it back, don't, she interrupted firmly. Just focus on getting everyone out safely. She hesitated, then added more softly, including yourself. Claire joined them, handing Scott a specialized radio. Direct connection to Dr. Garcia's monitoring systems. It'll give you real-time structural data. Thanks. Scott checked the device. Keep coordinating with the federal team on Maxwell's arrest. Don't let him slip away in the confusion. Already handled, Claire assured him. Chambers has him in custody, and they're securing his assets and records. Focus on my father and those residents. With firefighter Thompson leading, Scott entered Tower 1 through the emergency stairwell. The building's distress was immediately apparent, the subtle vibrations beneath their feet, the creaking of overtaxed structural elements, hairline cracks spiderwebbing across walls. Thompson to command, the firefighter radioed as they ascended, proceeding past floor 5, building movement noticeable but manageable. Scott monitored the structural data on his device, watching as stress indicators crept steadily upward. At floor 7, he paused to examine a support column where concrete had begun to spall away from internal rebar. Compression failure initiating, he noted. We need to warn Armstrong's team that the central columns are compromised first. They should evacuate toward the building's perimeter. As they continued upward, the stairwell began to show signs of separation from the main structure, small gaps appearing where previously solid connections existed. At floor 9, Scott halted abruptly. Listen, he instructed Thompson, holding. Perfectly still, a faint groaning emanated from the building's core, the distinctive sound of concrete under extreme stress. What is that? Thompson asked, tension evident in his voice. Imminent failure warning, Scott explained, consulting his monitor. The support columns are beginning to buckle. We need to move faster. They accelerated their ascent, reaching floor 16, where they encountered the first group of evacuees, 3 firefighters assisting elderly residents down the stairs. Armstrong? Scott questioned the lead firefighter. 2 floors up with the last group, 5 residents with mobility issues and special equipment needs. Tell him to abandon the central corridors, Scott instructed urgently. Building failure will propagate from the core outward. Stay along the perimeter. As the evacuation group continued downward, Scott and Thompson pressed on. The building's movements grew more pronounced with each passing minute, the structure groaning like a wounded animal. Floor 18 revealed a harrowing scene. Louis Armstrong and 2 firefighters were struggling with evacuation equipment for a resident on a medical bed. 2 other elderly residents sat in wheelchairs, attended by a 3rd firefighter. Finley? Armstrong looked up in disbelief. What are you doing here? Trying to keep history from repeating itself, Scott replied, moving immediately to assess the situation. We have less than 15 minutes before critical support failure. This equipment is too bulky for the time we have. Armstrong nodded, instantly grasping the severity. Recommendations? Scott quickly improvised. Transfer the patients to soft stretchers. 2 carriers per stretcher, moving in synchronized pairs down the outer stairwell. The central shaft is too unstable. As they quickly adapted to the new plan, Scott felt the building shudder, a concerning movement different from the previous tremors. That was floor 10, he announced, checking his monitor. Primary support column just shifted significantly. We need to move. Now, with practiced efficiency, Armstrong's team transferred the residents to emergency stretchers. Scott led them not toward the central stairwell they had ascended, but to an exterior fire escape on the building's east side. This route bypasses the most compromised sections, he explained as they began their descent. But we need to maintain a steady pace, no stopping. The journey downward was arduous. Each step carefully managed to balance speed with safety for the vulnerable residents. One elderly woman clutched Scott's arm, her eyes wide with fear, but her voice surprisingly steady. Young man, I survived the Newport flood of '78. I'm not about to let a poorly built condo take me out now. Despite the dire circumstances, Scott found himself smiling at her determination. We'll get you out, ma'am. Just a few more floors. At floor 13, a violent tremor shook the fire escape, dislodging chunks of facade that plummeted to the ground below. The structure swayed alarmingly, metal connections groaning under stress. Stabilize, Scott commanded, bracing himself against the railing. Everyone hold position until the movement subsides. Armstrong made his way to Scott's side as the shaking gradually diminished. We won't make it in time, will we? He asked quietly, ensuring the residents couldn't hear. Scott checked his monitor, noting the accelerating failure indicators with growing dread. Not all together like this. He made a rapid calculation. We need to split up. Faster teams ahead. With the more mobile residents, slower teams maintaining safe intervals behind. Armstrong nodded grimly. I'll take the rear group with the medical bed patient. You lead the first team down. That puts you at highest risk, Scott pointed out. Fitting, don't you think? Armstrong replied, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face, given my role in Somerset Plaza. Before Scott could respond, the building shuddered again, more violently this time. A deafening crack echoed from within. As a major support gave way, the fire escape lurched sickeningly, partially tearing away from its moorings. Go! Armstrong ordered, already organizing his group. We'll follow at safe distance. Scott led the first evacuation team downward at the fastest pace safely possible. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier kept pace remarkably well, her face set with determination. Floor by floor, they descended through the increasingly unstable structure, acutely aware of the disaster unfolding within its core. They reached the 5th floor when a catastrophic failure reverberated through the building. An ear-splitting crack, followed by cascading booms, announced the collapse of the central floors, exactly as Scott had predicted, beginning at level 10 and pancaking downward. Run! Scott shouted, abandoning measured evacuation for desperate speed. The whole structure is going. The final 5 floors became a blur of motion, the fire escape swaying dangerously as connections failed. When they reached ground level, emergency personnel rushed forward to assist the residents to safety. Scott immediately turned back toward the building, searching for Armstrong's group. Through dust and debris, he spotted them, still descending, now at approximately the 7th floor. Despite the building's partial internal collapse, the fire escape on that section was holding, if barely. Armstrong, Scott shouted up to them. East side is collapsing inward. Move to the south corner. Whether Armstrong heard or simply recognized the danger independently, He directed his team across a precarious section of exterior walkway toward the more stable southern portion of the structure. The maneuver was risky but necessary. The eastern section, where they had been descending, was being pulled into the building's imploding core. Scott grabbed a firefighter's radio. "I need spotlights on the south fire escape and ladders extended to the third-floor landing. They can't make it all the way down before that section fails." Emergency crews mobilized with remarkable speed, repositioning equipment to create an alternative escape route. Scott dashed toward the building, despite shouts from the command team to maintain the safety perimeter. The central and eastern portions of Tower 1 were now fully collapsing, floors pancaking downward in a catastrophic chain reaction that sent clouds of dust billowing outward. The south wing miraculously was holding, though for how long remained uncertain. Scott reached the base of the south fire escape just as Armstrong's team made it to the third floor. The structure was bending under their weight, connection points, or tearing from the failing building. "The ladder's coming," Scott called up to them. "2 more minutes." Armstrong looked down, making eye contact with Scott through the swirling dust. Something passed between them in that moment. An understanding, perhaps forgiveness, certainly mutual respect. "We don't have 2 minutes," Armstrong called back calmly. He turned to the firefighters with him. "Get the patient out first, then the others." As the emergency ladder extended toward them, Armstrong supervised the precarious transfer of the medical bed patient to the waiting rescue team. One by one, the remaining residents were evacuated from the failing fire escape to the relative safety of the ladder. Scott watched from below, counting each successful transfer. 4 residents safe, the 5th being guided across. Both firefighters, now on the ladder. Only Armstrong remained on the fire escape when a thunderous crack announced the south wing's structural failure. The fire escape tore away from the building, twisting violently. Armstrong leapt for the ladder, his fingers grasping the rungs as the platform beneath him disappeared into the churning mass of collapsing concrete and steel. For a heart-stopping moment, Armstrong dangled from the ladder, the full weight of Tower 1 seeming to collapse around him. Scott rushed forward with other rescuers, positioning himself beneath. Armstrong looked down, meeting Scott's eyes again. With a nearly imperceptible nod, he began descending, one careful rung at a time, as the building behind him disintegrated into rubble. When Armstrong's feet touched solid ground, Scott grabbed his arm, pulling him clear of falling debris. Together, they ran for the safety perimeter, the roar of the collapsing structure chasing them like a living thing. They reached the command center as Tower 1 completed its catastrophic failure, imploding into a mountain of broken concrete, twisted rebar, and shattered glass. The dust cloud rolled over them, momentarily blinding everyone in its path. When visibility returned, Scott found himself standing beside Armstrong, both of them coated in gray dust, breathing heavily from their narrow escape. "Thank you," Armstrong said simply, his voice hoarse. Scott nodded, words unnecessary between them. 5 years of bitterness dissolved in the shared experience of saving lives, of breaking the cycle that had begun at Somerset Plaza. Claire rushed forward, embracing her father with a sob of relief. Over her shoulder, Armstrong again met Scott's gaze. "We have unfinished business," he said quietly. "Your reputation, your career." "Later," Scott replied, turning to check on the evacuated residents being treated by medical personnel. "Right. Now let's make sure everyone's accounted for." The final tally was miraculous. All residents successfully evacuated, though Tower 1 was completely destroyed. Towers 2 and 3 stood empty, their occupants evacuated before structural failures could manifest. The property damage was catastrophic, but not a single life had been lost. As dawn broke over Newport, casting golden light across the devastation of Parkview Heights, Scott stood at the command center reviewing final reports. Diane approached, her injuries properly treated, a notebook in hand despite doctor's orders to rest. "You did it," she said simply. "You saved them all." "We saved them," Scott corrected, "including everyone who had participated in the evacuation and Diane's own role in exposing Maxwell. The system worked this time." "Because you forced it to," Diane observed. "One man who refused to stay silent." "One. A man with allies," Scott amended, watching as Claire and Armstrong coordinated with authorities on emergency housing for displaced residents. "What happens now?" Diane asked. "Maxwell's in custody, evidence secured, buildings saved or safely evacuated." Scott considered the question, looking out over Newport's skyline, a cityscape he had helped shape in his former career and had now helped protect in his unlikely second act. "Now we rebuild," he said finally, "not just buildings, but the systems that failed us, the inspections, the oversight, the accountability. And you, back to construction work?" Scott smiled tiredly. "I think my days of taking orders from foremen are over." A helicopter approached from the direction of Willowbrook, touching down in a cleared area near the command center. Scott recognized the markings, the private medical facility where his mother had been taken. Molly Davis emerged from the helicopter, helping Vera Finley navigate across the uneven ground. Despite her confusion about many things, Vera walked with purpose toward her son, somehow knowing exactly who to look for among the crowd of emergency workers. "Scott!" she called, her voice carrying across the space between them. "I saw the building falling on television. I knew you'd be here." Scott embraced his mother gently, this woman who still believed in him when he had stopped believing in himself. "I'm okay, Mom. Everyone got out safely." Vera touched his dust-covered face, her eyes momentarily clear and present. "Your father would be so proud. You always did care about doing things right." As Scott stood with his mother in the shadow of the disaster he had helped prevent, Armstrong approached, accompanied by Claire and a distinguished older man Scott didn't recognize. "Scott," Armstrong began formally, "this is Judge William Harrington of the Federal Circuit Court. He's been briefed on all aspects of Somerset Plaza and the evidence recovered from Maxwell and Hayes." Judge Harrington extended his hand. "Mr. Finley, the court will be issuing a formal exoneration regarding the Somerset Plaza incident based on newly discovered evidence. Your professional licenses and credentials will be reinstated immediately." The words Scott had waited 5 years to hear felt almost anticlimactic after the night's events. Yet they represented something profound, the restoration not just of his career, but of his place in the world. Additionally, Armstrong added, "Armstrong Construction would like to offer you a position heading our new Building Safety and Integrity Division. Full authority, independent oversight of all projects." Scott looked between Armstrong, the judge, and his mother, 3 different facets of his life converging in this moment of redemption. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, "but I think I might have a different path forward." Diane, who had been listening nearby, smiled knowingly. "Let me guess, some kind of independent oversight organization. A watchdog for the industry?" "Something like that," Scott confirmed. "Newport needs structural integrity standards that can't be compromised by political connections or profit margins." As dawn fully illuminated the cityscape, emergency workers continued their final sweeps of the disaster area. Television crews documented the destruction of Tower 1 while simultaneously celebrating the miraculous evacuation. Federal agents secured evidence from the scene for the ongoing case against Maxwell and his associates, and Scott Finley, once disgraced engineer turned construction worker, now stood vindicated, a man who had lost everything but his integrity, and in keeping that one thing, had ultimately regained everything else. "So," Diane closed her notebook, a journalist's instinct for the perfect ending evident in her expression, "when do we start?" Scott looked at the ruins of Parkview Heights, then to the helicopter that had brought his mother safely to him, and finally to the people who had helped him expose the truth: Diane, Claire, Armstrong, Reeves, and countless others who chose integrity over expedience. "We already have," he answered simply. "Today is just the beginning. The end." Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.